right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this lecture, sponsored by the Institute of World Politics. I'm Jim Robbins, the Dean of Academics at IWP. For those of you who are new to IWP, we're a graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs. We offer a doctoral program, 7 master's degrees, including 2 online MAs, and 18 certificates of graduate studies. So if you're interested in learning more about us, please feel free to speak to one of our staff at the conclusion of this event or visit our website at iwp.edu. We'd like to thank all our supporters, especially Michaela Hulbig. Is Michaela here? Who make our IWP events program possible. To support the work of IWP, please visit iwp.edu/donate. Talmage Boston is a well-known figure among leading historians as an author, speaker, and on-stage interviewer. He is the author of a number of books, including Cross-Examining History, Raising the Bar, Baseball and the Baby Boomer, and 1939, Baseball's Tipping Point. He is also one of the most highly recognized lawyers in Texas, having been chosen for 3 major statewide awards in the last 4 years by the Texas Bar Foundation and the State Bar of Texas Litigation Section. Mr. Boston has been named a Texas super lawyer by Thomson Reuters every year since 2003, and among the best lawyers in America every year since 2013. He's the only lawyer to receive a presidential citation from 8 different presidents of the State Bar of Texas for outstanding service to the State Bar. Last November, Talmage was recognized by the Dallas Historical Society as the History Maker of the Year in the field of promoting history in North Texas. Working as both a full-time commercial litigator and an award-winning noted historian, Talmage's varied experience and notable achievements in both fields make him uniquely qualified to write his new book, How the Best Did It: Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. Talmage lives in Dallas with his wife Claire, his son Scott, daughter Lindsay, son-in-law Mitchell, and young grandsons. To learn more, visit his website at talmageboston.com. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Talmage Boston.
Well, good afternoon, Institute of World Politics and faculty and students and friends and my own friends who are here in the audience. And I hope you're here for 2 reasons. Number 1, because you love history. And number 2, particularly among you students, because you aspire to be a great leader. Now, some lowbrows from the great unwashed may ask stupid questions like, what good is history? My favorite answer is, well, there's 2 reasons. Number 1, history shows us how much things change. And number 2, it shows us how much things stay the same. And sometimes history can actually be applied to our daily living. And that's my goal this afternoon, to give you reasons to think about upping your game as a leader for 2 thoughts associated that have stayed the same and are timeless. First, to be a great leader, you got to be a great persuader. And secondly, the same traits that make someone a great persuader today, they're the same as they were in George Washington's day. They haven't changed. Now, as Jim mentioned in his introduction, the name of my new book is How the Best Did It: Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. It's a combination leadership/presidential history book, and it covers the most important leadership traits of who I believe to be our 8 greatest presidents: Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, both Roosevelts, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Reagan. In the Q&A section after my speech, if you want to argue with me about why so-and-so is better than some of my 8, we can have that discussion. But the book's target audience is you, anybody who is or aspires to be a leader, and if you're already a leader, to be a better leader. And in researching the strengths of our 8 greatest presidents, I realized that they all had a common trait. They were all great persuaders, although they each went about persuading in his own unique way. And that's what I'm going to be covering in the next few minutes. So with that in mind, let's turn to the presidents, see what made them great persuaders, and then see if we can implement those ideas about effective leadership persuasion into our own leadership repertoire. First great president, George Washington. Now, as far as public persuasion went, Washington was not a great orator. He had 2 strikes against him before he ever really opened his mouth. Number one, he had a soft, breathy voice, which was a result of a childhood respiratory illness, which meant he couldn't project. And this was more than a century before anybody thought about inventing a microphone. And then secondly, as you may have come across in your own personal research, he had serious teeth issues. During his 8-year presidency, he only had 1 remaining tooth in his head. And so if you ever go to the museum at Mount Vernon, which I encourage you to do, you'll see his dentures. And you can't imagine how anybody could speak with that contraption in their mouth. It's like speaking with a small bird cage in your mouth. And yet, despite his voice and teeth issues, what he said was persuasive. So how could that be? If you can't project and you don't really like to speak, how are you an effective persuader? Well, first of all, people were aware of his deeds. To George Washington, deeds were more important than words. For all you young students, keep that in mind. And people were aware that, of course, he had been a military hero. He'd probably been the most admired American soldier fighting for the British during the French and Indian War. He'd had horses shot out from under him, bullet holes through his hats and his uniforms. It was a miracle that he survived the French and Indian War. And then, of course, soon thereafter, he was chosen to lead the Continental Army in the American Revolution, which lasted 8 years. And against all odds, the Americans prevailed. And then shortly after that, we realized that the United States, under the Articles of Confederation, was not working, that we would need a new constitution. And so at the Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia in 1787, Washington was chosen to be the presiding chairman, which resulted, of course, in the document that these people from these different states who had different opinions and didn't even know each other, but somehow at the end agreed upon and was ratified. And so people were aware that Washington had serious major military accomplishments as well as political accomplishments before he ever became president. And that earned him a certain amount of respect. When you're in the presence of somebody who you know has done some amazing, heroic things, you have a tendency to want to know what they say. But you don't just earn trust merely by being accomplished as a soldier or a political leader. It takes something more. It takes something in person. And so with his voice and his teeth issues, what was it about his approach to communication that made him such an effective persuader? Well, the first thing was that he always looked good. Right out of central casting, he looked like a leader. He dressed immaculately. The buttons on his sleeves were always exactly the right distance apart, whether he was wearing a military uniform or what he would wear in his political realm or on his farm at Mount Vernon, whatever it was, he always dressed immaculately. Secondly, he had piercing eye contact. Whenever you were in his presence and he was listening to you, the portrait artist Gilbert Stewart said, you look in George Washington's eyes and you see the eyes of the fiercest warrior in the jungle. If you're talking and George Washington's looking at you full face on, you know somebody very serious is paying attention to your every word. And for the most people, in most respects, most people I know kind of like to be listened to. He also had ramrod straight posture. I mean, he was erect, perfectly dressed, perfect grooming. He moved with an athlete's grace. He was the best horseman. He always rode an impressive white horse. And he was at 6'2", usually the tallest guy in the room. It'd be like being 6'9" today, given how heights have changed over time. So you put all of this together, and he had what is the term that I like to use is command presence. If you have command presence, you don't even have to say a word. You walk in the room and people are paying attention. They respect you. They want to hear what you have to say. So for all you students who aspire to be in leadership and young people who aspire to be in leadership, before you walk out of the door where you live, look yourself in the mirror and say, how's my command presence? Am I ready to project a strong, powerful, respectable appearance? Because that's going to make a difference. Gilbert Stuart's wife, Charlotte, said that George Washington was the most superb-looking person I've ever seen. But he was also an effective persuader in terms of what came out of his mouth beyond his mere physical presence because of his integrity / credibility. He could not tell a lie. Remember the Parson Weems fable? Papa, I chopped down the cherry tree, I cannot tell a lie. It was a fable. But Parson Weems was struggling to come up with a metaphor to describe the high level of integrity that George Washington had. And so that's what he chose. And in fact, he never did tell a lie. And thus whatever he said, you could take to the bank. That's a great way to earn trust. But in addition, he had a rare political gift, and that was, as a politician, he knew when not to speak. Too many politicians talk too much. That was not a problem with George Washington. And during his presidency, with each passing month, the friction got bigger and bigger and bigger. Soon there were two conflicting political parties, the Federalists, led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, the Republicans, as they were then called, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who ultimately evolved into today's Democratic Party, but at the time they were called Republicans. And with each passing month, the friction got worse and worse. Washington thought his great responsibility as our nation's first president was to be in charge of keeping the country unified. That was his most important role. And he knew that with this friction and these two parties going at it all the time, that to the extent he started taking sides, he would be the great divider instead of the great unifier. And so he mainly was in the business of listening. When it did come time for him to make a decision, it was only after he had carefully considered and asked for written position papers from both sides, which he would read and reflect on and finally make a decision. He had a great reputation for being a decision maker. But even if he went the other way, you knew that he had paid attention to your perspective and he had not been an aggressive advocate for the other side. That's how you maintain unity. One of his biographers, Mark Updegrove, says, conscious that political passions threatened to split the country during his presidency, he largely kept his voice still so as not to add to these political passions, keeping his opinions in check until policy decisions were required so as not to add to the divisions. So yes, sometimes staying silent while factions in your organization are clashing allows a leader to be in a better position to unify his team, to maintain some measure of equilibrium and stay above the fray. So George Washington, a great persuader because he had notch-in-the-belt accomplishments, command presence, integrity / credibility, and because he did what it took to be a unifier. Second great president, Thomas Jefferson. Now, like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson knew he wasn't a great public speaker. One of the most interesting facts that I found in my research was that during Jefferson's 8 years as president, he gave a grand total of 2 speeches. His 2 inaugural addresses were the only speeches he ever gave. Now, as you know, persuasion sometimes takes place when you're speaking with grand oratory and rhetoric to the masses, but a lot of times persuasion takes place in small groups. Committees, classes, dinner tables, one-on-one. That's where Jefferson was the master, where he could turn on his charm. He was always interpersonally very charming, except to Alexander Hamilton. He had a Renaissance man brilliance. He could talk about music, history, literature, agriculture, architecture, you name it. Just a dazzling scope of his brilliance. And he was a great conversationalist. He knew what to say to keep conversations going and to keep people engaged in conversations. And so using all these skills and knowing he was not a great public speaker, over the course of his 8-year presidency, 2 to 3 times every week, he hosted dinners where there were 12 to 18 people, and Republicans, Federalists. The one rule was, no, we will not talk about hot button issues. We'll talk about history and literature and music and what you do for a living and what's your family, who's in your family, and anything else you want to talk about, the kind of things that people talk about when they want to become friends, when they want walls to start coming down. There are 2 adages that I'm sure somewhere along the line here at the Institute of World Politics are covered that apply today and are timeless, and that certainly Jefferson demonstrated. Number 1, politics is all about relationships. If you have a great relationship with somebody, you're going to be able to do business with them in politics. And along the same line, the second adage, if someone likes you, he'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And if he doesn't, he won't. And so that was Jefferson. And over the course of these dinners, you don't do it in 1 dinner, you don't do it in 3 dinners, but 2 or 3 times a week for 8 years, slowly but surely the walls came down. And these dinners became a conversation among friends. And in his Jefferson biography, Jon Meacham said that at the dinners, Jefferson's, quote, social civility, grace, and hospitality softened the strident partisanship as feelings evolved from hostility to at least partial respect. So Thomas Jefferson, a great persuader because he was a relentless relationship builder. Third great president, Abraham Lincoln. Most people think of Lincoln as our most eloquent president, and he was. And yet you may wonder, how does somebody become so eloquent who has less than 1 year of formal schooling? He didn't go to high school or college or law school. He went to less than 1 year of school as a child, and that was it. So how did he get to be so eloquent? Well, he had 3 activities over the course of his life that were instrumental in his being in a position to be eloquent. Number 1, starting as a child, he was a voracious reader. There weren't that many books in the areas where he lived in Kentucky and Indiana growing up, but the books that were there were written by the great writers. Shakespeare's plays, the King James Bible, the classic poets, Aesop's fables, and he had a photographic memory. So when he read these books, he remembered them. He would have Shakespeare's line and scripture in the front of his brain and being able to call on them whenever the need arose to inject the eloquence of the great writers into his conversation or his speeches. So that was the first activity that led him to eloquence. The second, as you probably know, he was a very successful lawyer, both as a trial lawyer and an appellate lawyer. He argued over 400 cases to the Illinois Supreme Court and even one to the United States Supreme Court. Now, though, as Jim said in the introduction, I've been a trial and appellate lawyer for coming up on 46 years. And if you're going to stay in the game that long, as Lincoln did for 23 years, you've got to be able to assemble and organize and present an airtight argument in the most persuasive way. So being a lawyer for 23 years, he was constantly in a mode of developing the most persuasive arguments, which obviously he would need to be able to do in his political speeches. But also, as a lawyer, as a trial lawyer, he knew that when you're speaking to different audiences, you got to choose different words and tone in order to be the most effective persuader. You talk differently if you're trying to talk to a jury as opposed to a judge, as opposed to a client, as opposed to opposing counsel. Lincoln got that. And he would change voices, again, knowing who's in the audience and what's the best way to communicate with that person or persons. And then third, he was a politician for his entire adult life, starting when he was 23 years old. So he was constantly giving speeches to crowds. And for him, practice made perfect. So those were the activities over the course of his adult life that caused him to hone his skills and be in a position to be the person who hit the bullseye every time he aimed his words at a particular subject during his presidency. So with that as his experience level, what were the actual skills that he implemented to make his words be so impactful? First, he was obsessed with word precision. Many of you in high school or college came across Jon White, The Elements of Style, and you can boil that whole book down into 8 words. Eliminate unnecessary words. Say exactly what you mean. And that was Lincoln. That was the story of his speeches. No unnecessary words. The Gettysburg Address has 272 words, which means it's less than half the size of a normal newspaper editorial. There is not one unnecessary word. And as I heard in the film at Gettysburg on Monday night when I was visiting the museum there, in 2.5 minutes, he changed the soul of a nation forever. Now that's what you call impactful words. His other most famous eloquent speech, the other one that you see chiseled in the wall of the Lincoln Memorial, is his second inaugural address, the one that ends with malice toward none, with charity for all, 702 words. It took him 5.5 minutes to deliver. Think of all these rambling inaugural addresses you've heard in your life. Wouldn't it have been better if they had followed Strunk White and eliminated all the unnecessary words and had the powerhouse impact that Lincoln's eloquent speeches did? The second great word power trait that Lincoln had, like George Washington, he never misrepresented or overstated anything. Remember his nickname? Honest Abe. You could take his words to the bank. There was never any question about the accuracy of them. The third trait, he knew that you could build rapport with audiences by using wit and telling stories. Use wit carefully, don't overdo it, don't try to be a comedian, but get your audience to smile from time to time. It works, and people love stories as opposed to dry theory. You students certainly know that. Fourth, when it came time to reach his persuasion climax, he spoke with an impassioned, earnest tone. You saw that, Daniel Day-Lewis, in the Lincoln movie, but he was never emotional. He thought that was manipulative and dishonest. So it was impassioned, it was earnest, but it was not emotional. And then fifth and finally, the one that you probably not thought much about before and you need to think a whole lot more about going forward, is he always made sure that his words had rhythm. Music is memorable when it has the rhythm that stays with us. The same with words. Lincoln got that. And only if your words have rhythm can they be processed in such a way that they resonate, reverberate, and penetrate. Remember how the Gettysburg Address ends. This nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And this government, of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Rhythm. I'm hoping everyone in this room has read at least one book by David McCullough. And David told me years ago that whenever he finished a chapter in any of his books, and I mean finished, this was the final draft, I'm ready to send it to the publisher. But before he would do that, he would sit down with his wife Rosalie and have Rosalie read the chapter aloud to him so he could satisfy himself that his words on the page had the desired rhythm. So Abe Lincoln, a great persuader because he maximized his word power. He used the words of the great writers. He seriously edited to make sure that they were airtight, no ambiguity. He spoke the language of whoever his audience was, and because his words had rhythm and could be better processed. Fourth great president, Theodore Roosevelt. You remember it was TR who coined the phrase that whoever gets elected president all of a sudden has the power of the bully pulpit. And though he spoke to crowds often during his presidency from the bully pulpit, he was not a particularly effective speaker. He didn't understand Lincoln's recognition that your words have got to have rhythm. Theodore Roosevelt spoke with an almost machine gun-like rapidity. He was probably the highest IQ president we've ever had. He wrote more books than any president. He read more books than any president. He also had a photographic memory. He remembered everything he'd ever read. And so he's totally brilliant, and he was an extrovert, high energy. But what separated him from the rest of the pack as a communicator came, like Thomas Jefferson, in his up close and personal communication, particularly in the field of dealing with parties who were at war with each other and needed to come to a resolution to be able to move on. That's called mediation, where people are at war, they can't solve their problems, and a neutral mediator is appointed, not to say who's going to win or who's going to lose, who's right, who's wrong, but it's going to be able to hear what both sides have to say, brainstorm to come up with ideas that potentially could lead to some area of common ground on which they can agree and thereby put an end to their dispute. In her biography of Theodore Roosevelt titled The Bully Pulpit, Doris Kearns-Goodwin described his power as a mediator. He used his unusual powers of concentration, his rich cadre of ideas to be able to brainstorm potential solutions, and his ruthless single-mindedness, together with warmth, unabashed intensity, and pluck of personality to move people towards settlement. Pluck of personality, warmth. People got to like their mediator in order. He's going to beat on them until they finally get sensible and come to agree upon something that'll put an end to the dispute. You got to have a high likability factor if you're going to be in a position to accomplish that result. And Roosevelt's success as a mediator was unsurpassed. He'd been president of the United States for 1 year when all of a sudden there was this national coal strike. All the coal miners had gone on strike. And for months, they were talking back and forth with the owners of the coal companies without any success. There had never been an American president who'd gotten involved in a labor dispute before, but TR said, if I don't do something, winter's approaching and half the country's going to freeze to death because nobody's got coal. So he brought the parties together. He listened, he spoke, he learned, he brainstormed, finally came up with the idea that they could agree on, binding arbitration regarding their dispute. And once they had that agreement, strike was over, nobody froze to death. Word went around the world about this amazing skill as a peacemaker. And Japan and Russia were at war with each other. And they reached out to the President of the United States, man, you solved that coal strike, maybe you can help us. And he did. He mediated and brought them to settlement, and for it he won the Nobel Peace Prize. A couple years later, Morocco has a conflict going on that they don't know how to bring an end to. Roosevelt mediates that and gets resolution. And then a year later, the Hague Convention. There's another conflict that somebody's got to be brought in to bring it to an end, and Roosevelt did that. So Theodore Roosevelt, a great persuader, as a focused, shrewd, creative, and emotionally intelligent mediator. Fifth great president, Franklin Roosevelt. FDR was persuasive because he mastered not one but two ways of public speaking. First, powerful oratory to the masses with snap, crackle, and pop delivery when he spoke to crowds. And second, a calmer, more conversational style in his fireside chats on the radio that gently moved Americans to his way of thinking. As an example of his powerful oratory to the masses, in his first inaugural address, where here's the country in the middle of the Great Depression, people are homeless, people are starving. The prior president, Hoover, had not done enough to demonstrate his authentic concern, and up steps Franklin Roosevelt, strong eyes, beaming smile, and says, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And people stopped and thought, maybe I do need to get over this fear. And at least I know I've got a president who's not afraid of it. And who's going to be by our side to get us out of this ditch. And it sparked positive reaction. Another example of his impactful oratory to the masses was the day after the bombing at Pearl Harbor. These were his opening words. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces from the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. We will not only defend ourselves to the utmost, we'll make certain that this form of treachery will never happen again. It made Americans immediately want to step up, join the fight, and defeat the enemy starting right now. But besides this commanding oratory power, he also persuaded people with his gentle conversational delivery in his fireside chats. The day after he's sworn into office for his first term, there's a run on the banks nationwide. People are scared to death these banks are going to fold. They'll lose all their money. They pull all their money out of the accounts and stuff them in their mattress, and there's a panic. And so FDR, brand new president, welcome to the world. Aren't you glad you ran for president? You've got that going on. And he immediately closes all the banks, and he declares a national bank holiday. And a couple of days later, he gives his first ever fireside chat, and in it, very calmly, says, here's what I've done, here's why we've done it, here's what we're going to do in the future. There's no need to panic. It's all going to work out fine. The next day, the banks are opened, and the people are bringing money to deposit back into their bank accounts. The panic is over, but only because he used that calm, I've got this handled, no need to panic voice in his fireside chats. So for both of these kinds of communication, and in all forms of communication, if you're wanting to persuade somebody, starting point, where are they? What is their mindset? What are their beliefs? I know what I want them to think at the end of the day, but I got to know what their starting point is so I know exactly how to move the needle toward where I want them to go. And FDR was a master at grasping the public sentiment of the entire country, not just bits and pieces, different parts of the country, but the whole country. How did he do it? Well, first of all, he stayed in a mode of holding press conferences constantly. He was never afraid of any question. He wanted to know what was on the minds of all the reporters. Don't you wish we had that today? But we don't. But Roosevelt was open because I want to know what the public are thinking. I want to know how they're going to react to my answers to these press conferences. In addition to that, to the extent he could leave D.C., given his polio, but he would take car and train trips, which were much more about listening than speaking. And his wife, Eleanor, was famously gone all the time throughout his presidency, on the road, again, listening. What are the people in Arizona thinking? What are the people in Michigan thinking? What are the people in Rhode Island thinking? And would come back to Washington and give him a full report. He also stayed on top of the newly emerging industry of public opinion polls to find out what people were thinking. And last but not least, he was always calling in the leaders of both political parties. So he knew what they were thinking and what their party was thinking. And once he knew what people were thinking, which was often different from what he thought they should be thinking, he moved them his way by delivering his messages in increments, knowing that going too fast in delivering his ultimate plan would go over people's heads or be rejected out of hand. It takes people a while to process the idea of dramatic change. FDR's hero was Lincoln. Lincoln understood this. Lincoln didn't start out as president by saying, okay, folks, slavery's evil. We got to abolish slavery. That's the end of the story. No, that's what he wanted to happen. But that isn't how he opened his remarks. It was going to take time to get people to come around to that way of thinking, which obviously they did by 1865. FDR's situation was similar. In the late 30s and early 40s, most Americans were stuck in a mindset of isolationism. Here was a great war going on, Hitler, Mussolini, Japanese. Here's Winston Churchill trying against all odds to hold it together. And most Americans were stuck in a mode of isolationism. We don't want to go halfway around the world to fight another war. We did that 20 years ago in World War I. Don't ask us to do it again. FDR knew that's where their public sentiment was. But he also knew, from Churchill and everything else, that we couldn't stay stuck in isolationism because Hitler was going to take over the world if we didn't get involved. Europe didn't have enough firepower to be able to defeat the Nazis and the Axis powers. So fireside chat, one at a time, FDR, slowly but surely, got people out of their isolationist mindset toward recognizing the need to defeat Hitler. He would say in his early chats along these lines that he knew people didn't want to hear about the U.S. and war in the same sentence or the same paragraph, because that would trigger the isolationist mindset. So what he said was, look, folks, I'm not here to talk about war, but I am here to talk about national security. Softer, yet persuasive. And then a few fireside chats down the road, and he said, quote, all right, folks, the war is now approaching the brink of the Western Hemisphere itself. It's coming very close to home. Anyone with an atlas, anyone with a reasonable knowledge of the sudden striking force of modern war, knows that it is stupid to wait until a probable enemy has gained a foothold from which to attack. How could anyone argue with that? If we don't get involved in this war, Hitler's on the verge of the Western Hemisphere. He's going to have his foothold from which to attack. People got it. And we're ready to go. As soon as the bombing of Pearl Harbor and Hitler 2 days later declares war on the United States, we are ready to go. We are not thinking about isolationism anymore, because through his incremental method of communication, America had processed where it had to be if it wanted to preserve the United States of America and not be overtaken by Hitler. That's how communication works best. Incrementally, over time. Give people time to absorb it and think through their prior position and think through the facts that maybe they haven't focused on, and you can move them to where you want them to go. So Franklin Roosevelt, a persuader who knew when to speak with vigor in his powerful oratory, when to speak calmly in his fireside chats, and knew how to gauge and change public sentiment. Sixth great president, Dwight Eisenhower. Though Ike was not a great public speaker, if you see the old YouTubes, no, he was not a great public speaker, and yet nonetheless, historians now rate him as our fifth greatest president. Lincoln 1, Washington 2, FDR 3, Theodore Roosevelt 4, Eisenhower 5th. So how did he do that? What was his method of persuasion? Well, his method was again based on his performance, and that is once he set a goal, he persuaded people to do what it took to achieve that goal. End of story. And in particular, to persuade people on how to get things done the most effectively. He knew when to be patient, and he knew when and how to play hardball when the circumstances dictated. Look at how he directed D-Day. He waited patiently for the weather to change, and then he played hardball with the Normandy invasion. On his desk in the Oval Office was a saying that epitomized his style of leadership, quote, gently in manner, strongly in deed. Now, example of his exercising patience to accomplish his objective was his handling of Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare at the start of his presidency. Truman, his predecessor, had gone head-to-head with McCarthy, insulted him, called him names, and it just went nowhere. McCarthyism got stronger and stronger. Eisenhower could see that's not effective. Eisenhower refused to say McCarthy's name in public, but he devised a plan which, in time, gave McCarthy just enough rope to hang himself, which is exactly what happened, that Eisenhower's hidden hand policy that led to the Army of McCarthy hearings, and it was Army lawyer Joseph Welch, who went head to head with McCarthy and brought him down, and Eisenhower never even had to get his hands dirty. Now, an example of Ike's knowing when and how to play hardball came right before the election for his second term in October 1956. America's allies in World War II, a decade before, had all of a sudden joined forces, invaded Egypt, and seized the Suez Canal. And they had done it despite the fact that Eisenhower said, don't do it. It's going to screw everything up in the Middle East. It's going to disrupt the balance of power in the Cold War. It's going to give to the Soviet Union a reason to enter Egypt, and all of a sudden we're going to have World War III on our hands. Don't do it. And yet they did it. So when they did it, Eisenhower responded immediately with hardball. Number one, he got the United Nations to impose sanctions against him. Number two, he refused their request for an alternative source of oil. And finally, he refused to provide the dollars needed to stabilize the British pound. All that brought on a ceasefire. And Eisenhower, I don't want a ceasefire. I want your troops out of the Suez. And Britain balked and hesitated. So again, Ike played hardball. He made a run on the British pound, brought up as many pounds as he could get. He then called Britain's prime minister and said, if you don't get your troops out of the Suez, I, Dwight Eisenhower, President of the United States of America, will drive your pound down to zero. That's how you play hardball. In a nanosecond, those British troops had left the Suez and were going back. So that's how you do it. And that was his brilliance in persuading, knowing when to lay back and come up with a plan and be patient and let that plan develop, or when somebody is really out of line and blocking all the world order, you play hardball fast and firm. Seventh great president, John F. Kennedy. In his 1961 inaugural address, he famously said, ask not what you can do for your country. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And a couple weeks later, he creates the Peace Corps. And soon, tens of thousands of young Americans join the Peace Corps, go abroad, spread American goodwill around the world, enhance our public relations around the world, all because of these words that sparked this positive action. A year later, 1962, America's involved in the space race against the Soviet Union and everything associated with there. And Congress was balking at providing the funding needed to have a serious space program. So Kennedy gave a speech at Rice Stadium in Houston, and with these words, he inspired the national support for the American Moonshot program. We choose to go to the moon in this decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, unwilling to postpone, and we intend to win. And Congress then funded the Moonshot program, and within the decade, we had a man on the moon. A year later, 1963, he persuaded Americans that we needed to support civil rights for African Americans and bring an end to Jim Crow. His first 2 years as president, Kennedy had done nothing on civil rights. He thought it would alienate the Southern Democrats, who at the time were stuck in Jim Crow, and that if Kennedy was a big advocate for civil rights, he would not have any chance of being reelected in 1964. So he did nothing. But then in 1963, we had the Birmingham riots, and Sheriff Bull Connor pulled out the fire hoses and blasted the black children, and pulled out dozens of vicious attack dogs to attack the black adults. And it was all on national television, and Kennedy saw it, and he was sickened. And a couple of weeks went by, and Governor George Wallace blocks the door at the University of Alabama and refuses to let black students enter the University of Alabama. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Kennedy goes on national television that night and gives a speech that was largely spontaneous. And in it, he said, quote, "We face a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in our daily lives. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. And within a couple of weeks, he submits for the first time ever a strong civil rights bill to bring an end to Jim Crow. He works to get it through Congress, but he gets assassinated before it can go through. Fortunately, his successor, Lyndon Johnson, succeeds, and in July 1964, we had the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so you ask yourself, how could President John F. Kennedy have been so incredibly persuasive to the masses with his oratory, first on national service and the Peace Corps, second on the space program and the moonshot program, and third on civil rights? And the answer is, his biographer Stephen Knott says, the key to his success was that his words appealed to the better angels of our nature. Those immortal words from Lincoln's first inaugural address, his words appealed to the better angels of our nature, not to our dark side. So Kennedy, a great persuader who inspired hearts and minds that if something needed to be done, it could be done as long as we were operating from a mindset of doing the right thing. Eighth and last great president, Ronald Reagan, who entered the White House when America was in serious decline after the disastrous presidency of Jimmy Carter. Double-digit inflation, high unemployment, low economic growth, long gas lines, and we couldn't rescue our hostages from Iran. America was in a state of national malaise. We needed somebody to remind us of American exceptionalism, get us out of the malaise ditch, bring us back to being the great nation we had been throughout our history. And that person was Ronald Reagan. And to do that, he repeatedly said things to the nation with contagious conviction. Things like, we're here to do whatever it takes. America should be a shining city on a hill. My strategy for the Cold War, we win, they lose. On his Oval Office desk, block of wood, it can, all caps, C-A-N, it can be done. And it was that kind of optimism that never wavered and on which he followed through that brought an end to the Cold War, revived the American economy, and restored America's self-confidence. Pessimists don't move mountains. Only optimists move mountains, and the Reagan presidency proved that. So Reagan, a leader with the power to inspire optimism throughout the country. So there you have it, Institute of World Politics friends. Now may you remember how our greatest presidents used their unique styles of persuasion to achieve success. Washington, persuasion, as an accomplished command presence with unwavering integrity who knew when and when not to speak to preserve unity. Jefferson, persuasion, as a relentless relationship builder. Lincoln, persuasion, by maximizing his word power through clarity, sincerity, and precision. Theodore Roosevelt, persuasion, as a mediator with the power to find common ground between conflicting factions. Franklin Roosevelt, persuasion, by knowing when to speak forcefully and when to speak calmly, and knowing what the public sentiment was and how to move it. Eisenhower, persuasion, by knowing when to be patient and when and how to play hardball when necessary. Kennedy, persuasion, by inspiring us to be guided by the better angels of our natures and not our dark sides. And Reagan, persuasion, driven by constant, sincere optimism. So now that you know the history behind how the best did it, may you use it and apply it to your leadership persuasion repertoire. Thank you. All right, questions, comments? Argue with me. Tell me I'm wrong. Yes, Brother Ring. Roger.
Can you just clarify with Lincoln the distinction between passion and emotion?
Well, passion, you're speaking with an element of control and seeking to persuade. Emotion, you're going a step beyond control and trying to trigger reaction that is more emotional than rational. You can be passionate and speak to people's reason. When you go overboard and you're emotional, you're not speaking to their reason anymore, you're speaking to their emotions, which people know, smart people like all of you know, it's much better to be guided by your reason than by your emotions. And Lincoln didn't want people making decisions on the basis of their emotions, only on the basis of recognizing this is the reasonable and best way to proceed. So that's my best explanation for that difference. Yes?
I wrote an article a few years ago naming a list of the 10 best foreign policy presidents. I don't remember that well all the other 9, but I was very emphatic that the first president on the list was George Washington, both because of the Jay Treaty, which established the 20th century as the collision between America and the world, but more importantly because of the farewell address, which I consider to be the greatest document in American history. Would you please comment on my choice?
Well, in the book I go into the Jay Treaty, which at the time did succeed in avoiding a second war with Great Britain, but it was enormously unpopular, and Jefferson and Madison and all the Republicans thought that we had given up much and gained little, and only because of Washington's wide respect by the substantial majority of the American people was he the advocate that got the 2/3 vote necessary to ratify the treaty. So it wasn't so much a question of his foreign policy as such, but it was a demonstration of his powers of persuasion to get that treaty, which was the best that could be done under the time. It's darn hard, as we all know, to negotiate from a position of weakness. And Jay did not negotiate from a position of strength in his negotiations with the British. I agree with you certainly on the importance of Washington's farewell address, which he had the help of Alexander Hamilton in the writing. But in terms of setting the tone for America going forward, what should be our foreign policy, we should avoid entanglements abroad, which may well and historically have led to disputes that could have been avoided. So no doubt about it, Washington was a deep thinker in all aspects of his policy. But I'm often asked the question, out of these 8 presidents, what were the common traits? Well, one of them you just heard. Great leaders are great persuaders. They were all great persuaders. But the second is they were all self-aware. They knew their strengths and their weaknesses. And where they were strong, you find ways to use your strength. Where he was weak, you get somebody who's strong in that area and you bring them into the discussion and you want them to help guide the ultimate decision. And so, for example, in the farewell address, bringing in Hamilton's input, Washington would be the first to acknowledge that Hamilton was a higher IQ than he was. That's why he had turned over the issue of solving the economic crisis at the start of the country to Hamilton. Washington wasn't an economist. He didn't have an idea for how to come up with fiscal policies, but he knew Hamilton did. And so he said, great. So he was a great final decision maker, but he wanted the input of people who he recognized were strong in the areas where he was weak. And then the third common trait among these successful 8 presidents was that each of them in terms of their strategy for governing, were targeting their focus on the great American middle. Not the extreme right, not the extreme left, but the great American middle. And that's how government works when it works. And that's why government doesn't work when anybody is trying to lead the country either targeting the far right or the far left. So those are the three common traits, and Washington certainly had all of those traits in his own unique way. Other questions, comments? Come on, folks. Yes?
Quick question. You mentioned self-awareness. You mentioned, Sebastian, to mind that you mentioned self-awareness. You mentioned the ability to listen. We could argue that it's a little bit more challenging in a very noisy environment. What are some of the ways that we can create that space where people can still have the time or the conduit to listen to each other?
Well, they need to read my book.
Convince them to read.
It's all a matter of life experience. And if you go through life being aggressive about emphasizing your own talking as opposed to your own listening, in all likelihood, you're not going to be very successful. And so, and there's also, and this was getting back to Washington, because he had this humility to recognize where he was weak and be able to bring in these smart people, that makes you more open to being in a collaborative state of mind. And so collaboration can only happen when one side is listening and other folks are talking. You take the listening element out and there is no collaboration because everybody's just operating on his or her own unique agenda. And that is going to prohibit effective collaboration. And certainly if you're going to be a successful president, you've got to recognize that you can't do everything. Everything's not going to go your way. You're going to need the assistance of your colleagues in the cabinet, your people in Congress who are aligned with your particular policies, with the American people, with foreign leaders. And to do that, they've got to, going back to what I said, they got to like you. They want to give you the benefit of the doubt. They want to be on your side because they respect you, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how successful government works. And yes, there's a lot of social media. There's a lot of new technological angles that make achieving effective governance more difficult, but that doesn't mean that smart people just flat can't do it. Smart people can do it. Throughout our history, they have done it. Unfortunately, they typically don't do it in consecutive presidencies. There's usually a gap between our great leaders and our great presidents. And we can only hope that in the hopefully not too distant future, we will again return to a situation where we have great leaders who, in fact, have these traits of our 8 greatest presidents. Yes, Bob.
Thank you. Bob Mitchell with the Bipartisan Leadership Project. I've now heard you twice, and you get better.
Well, the first time you heard me was in an interview format. Now you've heard the speech.
It was, and I think you have got so much rich material to give. This is a better format, actually. But a question. Because most of these leaders, even as late as Eisenhower, did not have the same media attention, the same voices as we have today. So did our earlier leaders have more freedom to exert their own will, their own philosophy, or did public opinion, was it as strong back then as it is today?
It hasn't changed. In George Washington's presidency, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of competing newspapers. Some were Federalist-oriented, some were Republican-oriented. They were always, either one was praising Washington or one was attacking Washington. You know, through the years, obviously technology develops. And people who are really smart find ways to embrace it and use it effectively, as Franklin Roosevelt did with the radio, as Kennedy and Reagan did with the television. Presidents Obama and Trump certainly have attempted to use social media. There's all kinds of communication experts at the forefront of the new technologies, and that is the responsibility of the president to make sure he or she understands that media and how best to work within it to get your message across. And it's not so obtuse and unintelligible that smart people can't get their arms around it rather quickly. The challenge is creating the content, the words that get spoken, whether it's on social media or television or radio or in person, whatever it may be. As long as the content is airtight and delivered with a powerful and sincere delivery, then those words are going to come through. They're going to be persuasive. But when you lose that, your words aren't very good, that it doesn't matter how adept you think you may be in the technology of the media of that time. If your words aren't any good, they're not going to go anywhere. I've often gotten the question, but in the modern era, there were speechwriters. So those weren't, well, the answer is yes, since Franklin Roosevelt, perhaps before, but at least starting with Franklin Roosevelt, yes, there were speechwriters. But the president always had the final word. And particularly for the two most eloquent modern era presidents, John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, they had speechwriters, but they had the final say and were heavy editors to make sure that the words that they said were in fact their words. And famously, Reagan, the most famous speech at the Brandenburg Gate, where he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." His speechwriters didn't want that in there. The State Department didn't want that in. They thought it was going to upset Gorbachev and screw everything up. Reagan said, "No, I'm the President of the United States. I get to say what I want. That's what I want to say." And those are the most famous words of his presidency. So, yes, full-time speechwriters who spend so much time around the presidents are great and save a lot of time for the president by creating rock-solid first drafts or final drafts. But he gets, or she, in some subsequent presidency, will have the final say and will insist, great leaders will insist, that nothing that comes out of my mouth is something that I'm in any way uncomfortable with. These are my words, and I know they're going to be recorded and preserved for history. I'm going to have to stand by them, and so I've got to take ownership of them. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Sam with the Fund for American Studies. I'm curious, which president's persuasion style would you think would be the most successful in today's political climate?
I think Lincoln, FDR, Kennedy, and Reagan, across the board, they're all four of them incredibly eloquent. All four of them had commanding delivery styles. The content was superb. No unnecessary words, clear as a bell, no ambiguity, delivered with a sense of conviction and earnestness. I encourage you to listen or pull up the YouTube of Reagan's speech at Moscow State University in 1988 and what he told those young Russian students about democracy and the future, and you'll have tears in your eyes. Pull up John F. Kennedy, Ich bin ein Berliner speech, where he's in West Berlin, which is got the wall all around it and on threat of the Soviets overtaking it any day, and Kennedy is saying, "Have courage, maintain courage, we're beside you, the world's beside you." And I'm here to say, Ich bin ein Berliner, I'm a Berliner. That's how strongly I believe in your mission and your courage, and I want to be a part of it. And it doesn't get any better than that. And of course, FDR, those words that I read from after Pearl Harbor and his first inaugural address. And of course, Lincoln, the Gettysburg, of course, we don't have a recording of that, but you can just keep reading those words over and over again and say, damn, wow, that was just the flow. Again, the rhythm, but the power of these airtight messages that hit you right between the eye every time and say, yeah, that's it, that's right, that's the way to think. So all four of those people are going to do great in any era because, obviously when you're saying that kind of stuff in small groups, it's persuasive, but when you're saying it to the masses and you can communicate Kennedy, look at, my goodness, civil rights, where he's saying this is no longer a political issue. This is a moral issue. And America says, yep, that's right. That's right. And within a year, we got the Civil Rights Act. So that's why I'm hoping all you students are thinking about how you can be better persuaders, how you can use some of this stuff. I mean, one of the great mysteries in American history to me, presidential history, is that President George H.W. Bush, our 41st president, who was brilliant, engaging, had every position around the world you could think of, had everything. He'd served as, ambassador to China, head of the CIA, U.S. congressman, vice president. He always had his eye on the ball. He wanted to be president. And for 4 years, he was a darn good president, particularly in the area of foreign policy. But he never took the time to work hard on being a better speaker, which was a mystery. In this day and time where we have radio, where we have television, we have all this kind of stuff, why aren't you doing what Kennedy and Reagan did, refining your capacity to project and persuade and get people excited about your agenda by doing everything you can to be the most effective public speaker you can be? He didn't do that, and Bill Clinton defeated his re-election, and he was a very successful one-term president. So I would say to the students, in person and virtually, if you truly are aspiring to be a great leader, never sell short the time and effort that you need to spend becoming a more effective public presenter. It will only pay dividends, and if you don't have it, you're not going to be able to excite followers to go your way. Yes, sir.
I just want to apologize. I came late a little bit. I'm a student here at the
Could you still speak up even though you got the microphone in your hand?
Okay, thank you so much. I'm a student here. My name is God Bless Tugure.
Your name is God Bless?
Correct.
Way to go. What a great name. I'm 70 years old. You're the first God Bless I've ever met.
So I was reading, for me, I didn't want to be here at this time because I've got classes at 6:30, but when I saw the topic, how the best did it, and it was about America, I was like, okay, I needed a copy. And I've just heard you now say the most effective president within the U.S. were those who led with the great middle of the
Yes.
in perspective. And of course, just following American politics for the last couple of years, there's been a drift towards the right or the extreme right,
Right.
and the extreme left.
That's why 70% of the American people don't want Biden or Trump.
Great. I mean, in a world where you have so much identity politics or the rise of identity in the way nations are designed now, how would you advise? That's the word.
I would advise that identity politics are the extreme right and the extreme left and are a substantial minority and are not a majority. And my advice would be, as Franklin Roosevelt, think of any and every way to get information on the great American middle, what their issues are, what their perspectives on the issues are, and what they want to hear somebody say that is not extreme right or extreme left, and that is aimed at causing the government to perform effectively as opposed to being dysfunctional as it's been for the last several years. I think if everybody who aspired to national office, whether it's local in Congress or the presidency or anything else, these days did what these predecessors did of knowing where the real mood of the country was as opposed to the substantial minorities on either side, then you'd see somebody who's not consumed with identity politics but is actually consumed with trying to achieve great things for the American people through the federal government. That would be my focus.
Okay, but so my follow-up to that would be, how about losing critical support that is important to get to the finish
Yeah, well, that boils down to the real issue today is primary politics. That if you want to run in the Republican primary for any office and you want to win, you've got to be on the far right because people don't vote in the primaries like they do in the general election. And so those on the extremes, whether we're talking about the right on the Republicans or the left on the Democrats, are typically going to win the primaries, and then they're the candidates. And then we say, oh my gosh, here we are in the final election and we got an extreme right, we got an extreme left. That's not where I am, and yet those are my only two candidates. So it's all about coming up with a reformation of the primary system that's going to defeat that outcome that has come to be in all of our recent elections, and that's why government doesn't work anymore, because people have been elected by appealing to the extreme sides of the population and not to the moderate people who historically have succeeded in causing the country to move forward without gridlock and dysfunction.
So my final question would be foreign policy and what is happening globally. So I'm from Africa, and we've seen a lot of interest in terms of great powers coming to the continent right now. I mean, it's always been there. And you have the realities on the ground where people's perception of the United States has changed over the years, and of course with the influx of other countries like China and Russia. How would you advise today's president, how would you advise them to deal with foreign policy in terms of current realities of how other countries are meeting third world nations or developing countries act infrastructure?
Well, in answer to that question, it goes back to if somebody likes you, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt. So if I'm wanting to deal with an African nation and get them to go along, I've got to be in communication with them on a frequent, meaningful basis. I've got to understand that country's needs as well as be candid about what our country in fact can do to enhance them, but at least have that steady, meaningful dialogue that's going in order to develop this relationship. I don't know if you were here, politics are about relationships, which are everything. If you and I never talk and we have no relationship, then when it comes time to make a decision, we're in that void. Whereas if we have a history of fellowship and open dialogue and so forth, even if I say something that you may not fully agree with, you're going to understand it, you're going to understand my rationale, and hopefully you're going to respect it. That's how you build goodwill with whoever you're trying to deal with around the world, is by maintaining that, as opposed to being either non-communicative or harsh without providing ample explanation for why you're doing what you're doing in relation to that particular country. That's how you have effective foreign policy and successful long-term foreign relationships. Yes, sir.
Just do one more.
I have to ask about the assassinations of Lincoln and Kennedy. I would argue that successful leaders are good at setting up leadership transitions, especially in democratic systems where transition is expected, and that an assassination ultimately is sort of an indication of a leadership failure. Can you comment on that?
Well, in Lincoln's case, it definitely resulted in a leadership failure, because for his second term, and he'd been reelected in November 1864, he chose a new vice president in Andrew Johnson, who, on the one hand, he wanted because he was the only Southerner who was in the U.S. Congress, and he was looking for ways to communicate his desire to reconcile the country when the war ended and we would have reunited states of America. So on the one hand, that was a logical choice just because of where Johnson was from and what his position was at the time. But neither Lincoln nor anybody else did due diligence on Andrew Johnson, who turned out to be a horrible failure as Lincoln's successor. In the C-SPAN presidential ranking poll, he's ranked the worst president in history, and Lincoln's ranked the best. So because there was not a due diligence analysis of what kind of a potential leader Andrew Johnson would be, That was a serious shortcoming in Lincoln's presidency by reason of the assassination. On the other hand, John F. Kennedy had chosen for his vice president Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson had been the master of the Senate, was a legislative genius, knew how to work with Congress, knew how to get things done, was obviously not strong in foreign policy, but nonetheless, because John F. Kennedy had chosen Lyndon Johnson, who he had been in the U.S. Senate with for years, he had somebody upon his assassination who could step in and all of a sudden get the Civil Rights Act passed, and then the Voting Rights Act passed, and then the Fair Housing. So in terms of succession planning, it's extremely important to make the decision who's going to be the vice president. I mean, fortunately, we have not had an assassination since 1963, and hopefully we won't anytime soon. But people don't just die by assassination. Sometimes they have strokes. Sometimes they have heart attacks. Whatever it may be, you better make sure you have somebody in the vice presidential position who's ready to step up and continue what you're trying to achieve. And that is an essential ingredient in effective succession planning. Did you have a follow-up?
Well, I would just say to that maybe even if the transition plan is effective, that there's a potential for assassination because people are afraid of what the leader might do after they step down.
Well, we've never had a double assassination. We've never had a president and a vice president assassinated.
No, because the president has a lot of information and it's not clear what will happen once they're no longer in power. And so I think the skill of the president would be to make the people comfortable with their transition plan, with their plans for when they are no longer in power, so that they're not being assassinated.
Well, I don't think any president, particularly during his first term or even early in his second term, is thinking in terms of succession plans. They have every reason to expect, I'm going to fill this 4-year term. And until very recently, when now we have a president who's over 80 years old and a presumptive nominee who's almost 80 years old, when there is a real likelihood of a stroke or a heart attack or whatever that may bring a premature end before the term expires. But this is a unique situation in American history. We haven't had that before. But, you know, a president has his cabinet and people associated with him who typically will continue in the event the president dies and can carry on whatever it is that particular agenda was. I see some people are getting ready to leave. That's the last question. There are copies of books out here. I'm going to be staying around, and if you're interested in purchasing one, I'd love to sign it. I've certainly enjoyed this wonderful audience, this wonderful Institute for World Politics, and all you do here. I'm a supporter from Dallas, and now that I've seen it in person, I feel that much better about everything you're doing.
All right. I would like to thank Talmage for what really was a master class in the art of persuasion, because I'm going to buy that book for sure. And one takeaway I had from listening to this presentation was that if you want to be heard, you have to listen. First listen, then you'll be heard. So that was my takeaway. I'd like to thank all you who joined us today. If you're interested in learning more about IWP or our courses or programs or coming here to study or seeing more great presentations like this, you can visit us online at iwp.edu, or you can talk to me or any of our staff members who are here. We're the ones with name tags. And if you would like to purchase a copy of the book, they will be on sale in the library. I'll bet they'll even get autograph. See, there you go. So thanks y'all for coming, and see you next time.